But what we are going to teach you all, hopefully, from these two wonderful gentlemen who are about to join us, is the fact that Medicare for All is a very fiscally conservative approach to healthcare. It is infinitely more feasible and viable for everybody. It is all about removing the for-profit middlemen in between us and our doctors.
People you've been being lied to for a very long time.
Very long time.
And that's the thing. So it is the fiscally responsible thing to do. It is a true Republican in what used to be a Republican, but this would be the fiscally conservative thing to do, because you wouldn't want people profiting where you didn't need to have people profiting in the middle. That's waste.
And who better could we possibly bring on to talk about that than somebody who was an executive at one of the 2 or 3 largest private insurance companies in the United States, Cigna. And that, of course, is none other than Wendell Potter. Welcome back to Generational Change, sir.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. And in the other corner.
And I'm very excited about this pairing because, again, and I know I've said this to you, and I know I've said this to Fadhel, but I'm really the person who needs the economics for dummies. And here's the thing is I don't really understand, but I really don't care to. I don't I just don't. I just know it's right. And
the more you hear it, the more you learn. And the
right. But I don't need to know the details. That's what accountants are for. So that's what people like Fadhel and economics people are for.
So we are big supporters of modern monetary theory.
Shout out to the Real Progressives for sending us the best
myth,
and the book.
I have read. You are
and
reading.
I will read, but the truth is, okay, I'm an audiobook girl now, and don't hate on me. Don't hate on me.
I can't. You can't hate it for that reason. But you have been lied to. We can absolutely pay for healthcare, and it is a true investment because when you invest in it, it is better results for the economy. Again, it's all simple stuff, but we need experts to explain it.
Apparently,
and so. Fadhel,
I do.
Yeah, well, Fadhel, welcome back to Generational Change, Mr. MMT expert himself. And we are thrilled to have you guys with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Is this the first time you two are meeting?
They emailed it.
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Big fan, but honored to be on the panel with you, Wendell.
And we are all about the coalition.
We do. That's our thing. And the truth is that when you get everybody together who has the same mission is the only way you can actually get anything done. And I think that we spend way too much time infighting amongst ourselves, especially on the left, and it's very unproductive. So the more we can do to amass people that have the most information is what we're trying to do. So there we are. So this is going to be, we're going to talk about really how you're going to pay for it. Which we at this point laugh at because we know that that's ridiculous. But really, we need to get to what is the economics of this? We want to explain this for people.
And I think on the two sides, obviously, you have the MMT component, which is basically showing that when they say that, how are you going to pay for it? It is an infrastructural investment in a healthcare system. So in reality, you're actually spending less. There is this and then this is where the other component comes in, which is the for-profit middlemen, which is what is really sucking the air out of the room. Cigna, Aetna, United, Blue Cross, and so on, they are a for-profit industry that doesn't actually provide a service that does any good. So I'm curious as to, from both of your perspectives, whoever wants to start, on the first side, I think what it really comes down to is explaining what is our biggest hindrance to getting Medicare for all in the United States right now. And then on the other side, debunking this nonsensical
how you going to pay
corporate talking point, which is, well, we can't afford it.
I know.
Maybe I'll start. I think it is the main reason is because of the power and influence of the big companies I used to work for. They have become even more powerful and richer than when I was in the industry. I don't think a lot of folks realize that there are 2 big health insurers that are now in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 of the U.S. companies. Aetna is part of CVS, which is now number 4, and United Healthcare is number 5. Cigna is not much farther back in the pack at number 13. So you've got these enormous corporations that have huge sums of money, and they skim off portions of what we pay in premiums to finance their propaganda campaigns and their lobbying efforts. They spend huge sums of money in campaign contributions to influence who wins, and they have a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle in their pockets. And the work that I was a part of was the propaganda machine. and they spend huge amounts of money to mislead the American public. And the work I'm doing now is to try to explain how that happens and to make amends for what I used to do for a living. But it is those middlemen that are unnecessary. You're exactly right.
And so I want to ask you, like, let's say, and I obviously this is not something where you expect an exact number, but how much money is having that middle layer really wasting? Like, you know, when we look at other countries that have spend less for better outcomes, you know, how much money is being wasted in that middle area versus, you know, for how much service they're actually providing? Like, what is that waste of money?
It's about 30%, if not more, of what we spend in this country on healthcare, which is now about $4 trillion. And a huge amount of that flows through these big companies that are not necessary. And a lot of that is just unnecessary administrative overhead and profit. The problem is, it's not only the administrative problems within these big companies, but it necessitates hospitals and physician offices and all healthcare providers to have staff who do nothing more than deal day in and day out with insurance company bureaucrats.
Yeah.
When we think about the whitewashing of, you know, what actually goes on in terms of how you actually pay for this, there's still this misnomer about the fact that we are a currency issuer and that our goal is to balance inflation. I'm actually studying for real estate right now and I'm learning about it. So MMT actually covers being a realtor. Crazy, right? I think people really need to understand that when you're printing money, there's a balancing act that has to happen. And it's no different than when you're investing in education. There are services that don't actually have value, but healthcare is an absolute value because everybody needs it. And so if you can, Fadhel, obviously jump in and, you know, talk about this smear campaign, because at this point it's just a smear campaign, because they're really running out of things to say about, well, we simply can't afford it. But as we know, universal healthcare exists all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start with one simple observation. Let's figure out, you know, is there actual support in this democracy for Medicare for all? And the answer is yes. You know, the polling numbers are very consistent that the majority of Americans want it very badly. Number two, recognizing who's actually opposing this and who's really pushing for all of this myth about we can't afford it, it's too inefficient and all of that. You're going to have to wait for months to get your, you know, doctor's appointment. The people who oppose this is literally a handful of people that we can, you know, identify very directly. It's health insurance companies. It's the super PACs that they fund. It's the majority of elected officials who are brought to you by those super PACs, the media companies that spins their stories, and their lobbyists. And they manage with billions and billions of dollars of propaganda to convince less than 30% of the public that we shouldn't have Medicare for all. But the genie is out of the bottle. The majority of the population understand this. And I think that's why this is really fundamentally a question about democracy. The question about can we afford it, I'm going to set aside MMT now and all the big ideas about, you know, federal deficits and all that. Set them aside for a second and just think common sense, because this is what most Americans are thinking about. Common sense. Would you rather spend some money in a preventative way on health or infrastructure or anything, or not do that because you think you can't afford it and then pay for it many times over with money, blood, and tears, literally, in most cases? Common sense says, no, you spend on the preventative stuff to get rid of the root causes of the problem. And this is what every doctor tells you. This is what every contractor tells you: fix the roof before you have to fix the leak, before you have to change the whole thing and rebuild the house. This is what we're talking about. And then the middleman, which is the health insurance companies here, is a big part of the problem. And this is a political problem. This is a problem of democracy. So what MMT is telling us essentially is that the United States federal government can afford the spending on the infrastructure, on health and education and all of this. That's not the problem. The problem is the risk of inflation from additional spending. And when you look at pre-COVID, this panic about inflation and supply chain and everything, the major drivers of inflation in the U.S. economy for decades, we have four major sources of inflation pressure point. One of them is healthcare, one of the major ones. And it's not because we don't know how to build hospitals or build, technology or train doctors and nurses. We know how to do this. We have the best universities in the world, the research and development, all of that. It's just we have a handful of key players who literally control the supply of skills, and that's the American Medical Association. They limit how many people we produce in the industry. We have a handful of hospital chains and health insurance companies who control the actual productive capacity and suck the lifeblood out of the system. And then we have price setters, abusive price setters who can simply raise prices simply because we can, simply because they can, and simply because the 535 people we elect who are supposed to tax and regulate that market power out of existence, they actually let them do it because the super PACs are the super PACs that bring them to Washington, D.C. So this is fundamentally about electing 535 people who believe in a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the health insurance companies for the super PACs and for the oligarchs. So it's very clear. We have the resources, the technology, the financial capabilities to deliver the best healthcare system in the world. And we know who's standing in the way. And we know what to do if we truly believe in the democratic process, to restore the democratic process and get the oligarchs out of the way.
That's a great segue. Wendell.
Yellow vests for all.
Yeah, I'm curious because, we just had State Senator Gustavo Rivera, who wrote the New York Health Act, on our show the other day. I do think that there is a real shot of what's going to ultimately happen. The way we're going to break through is the way we did in Canada, which was this province of Saskatchewan was able to push through universal healthcare first, and then eventually it spread to the whole country. I think something like that is likely to happen here in the United States, and I do think the New York Health Act is the one that's probably the closest right now. Can you talk about some of the things that private insurance is going to employ, especially if momentum really starts to pick up?
I sure will, and I think you're right about the New York Health Act. In fact, I testified at a field hearing. I guess it was year before last in I think it was Kingston, New York, on behalf of that legislation. The industry will spend whatever it takes to try to kill that bill and others like it. And just to give you an indication of what they do, Colorado lawmakers were trying to pass a bill that would create a state-based public option. The insurance industry and its allies didn't like that. They spent more money lobbying against that bill than any entity had ever spent in the history of Colorado against that very bill. We were asked by advocates to step in and try to expose their dirty tricks, and we did. And they, lawmakers did pass something. It wasn't what was originally written, but that's just an example of what they do. During the primaries and the caucuses last year, the industry spent through its front group more money than some of the candidates spent in Iowa, as an example. So that's what they do. And as I said before, it's our money they're spending. They're taking our money to fund these propaganda campaigns. The front group that I referenced is called the Partnership for America's Healthcare Future, and it includes some of the people the organizations that were parts of the industry that Fadhel was mentioning: the American Hospital Association, the Federation of American Health System, which represents for-profit hospitals, pharma, America's health insurance companies. They're all pooling their money to try to keep legislation from happening at the state or federal level.
I've heard this argument that this isn't something that should be done at the state level, that this isn't something that can really work being done at the state level, and that there's almost like a disagreement about that. And I always take the approach that you take your wins where you get them, and you just kind of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. But I was wondering, do either of you have any opinions on that? Like the idea of this going with this state plan versus doing a national?
I'll start. I think I agree with you. I think it's important to try it on all fronts. And as Peter mentioned, it started in Canada in Saskatchewan and spread across Canada. I mean, it wasn't something that started out of Ottawa. And I think the same thing could happen here. Legislation has passed a couple of times in California, but was vetoed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Other states have legislation to try to move it forward. Yeah, in California, I think that the Democrats knew that they could support that, and because and the insurance
because it wouldn't go anywhere.
It wasn't going to go anywhere, exactly.
I love Mick resistance. Don't you like Mick resistance?
Right. But I disagree with those who say we need to dismiss those efforts. There's an organization called One Payer States that I support them and participate in some of their calls and strategy sessions. And I think it's important. I think it's important to keep the pressure on federal lawmakers and to support the legislation that is before Congress as well, too. Who knows what might break first, but I think it's important to try the state approach as well as the federal approach.
Is there a downside? Like, Fadhel, like, do you know? I mean, like, is there a negative? What are the people that are arguing against that? Like, what's the potential downside of that?
It's really, the devil is in the detail, as we say. So I am in favor of trying at all levels, but we have to have kind of a coherent strategy because we're fighting a massive beast in this effort. So here's where some of the nuances and challenges might be tricky. One is that, you know, it's not just about introducing health insurance coverage at the state level and having it be state funded, and then we can talk about how to fund it at the state level. It's about taxing and regulating abusive market power. Mm-hmm. It's about reinforcing existing antitrust laws and actually executing that implementation, which can't be done at the state level. We're talking about multinational corporations that know how to play the system and have armies of lawyers and lobbyists working in this space. So yes, we need to try to push at the local state level, mostly to mobilize these efforts, but the fundamental solution must be at the national level, at the federal level. That's point number one. Point number two, in terms of how do you fund it at the state level, this is where states are different from the federal government, because states are limited by their tax revenues and borrowing capacity, whereas the federal government has the capacity to create money out of thin air, essentially, and have deficit spending at the federal level that states can't afford, which means states will be forced to tax a particular thing to fund these programs. And guess who's ahead of us in this game, especially in Appalachia and the southern states? It's the oil and gas industry. They're saying, if you want to have your state-based system, you need to let us frack, because we're going to create the jobs and create the revenue streams for your states to have your health care. So we're going to pollute the hell out of the state, give you cancer, and out of that, you'll get a little bit of funding for your health insurance system. So we have to be very careful in terms of how do we push for this at the local level, but never lose sight of the bigger prize, of the bigger fight, which must be at the national level for funding purposes, for antitrust and regulation purposes. Those things have to be done at the federal level. But I'm not going to stop people from organizing at the local level. This is extremely important. Right. But at the same time, make sure that we're pushing on all fronts. Mm-hmm.
You know, I'll admit, when we were in D.C. Over a year ago and first heard you speak, I was like, what is this stuff? And I think that there's just this natural...
I often go into where I hear the teacher from Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
I do. Not with you. I mean, just when people start talking about the numbers, not you in particular.
It's like,
I don't.
No, it's weird. It's
like he makes it really understandable for me.
Well, it's an interesting yin and yang.
He and Steve both can do that.
That's what I was just going to say. Like, you are the professorial type who can explain it to, let's say, like the liberal class, whereas somebody like Steve Grumbine is definitely...
He's a little more rough around the edges.
He appeals more to the rural type of voter who just needs to, you need to hit him like a bull in a china shop. But I think once you hear it, after a while, you just recognize that, we really do need to evolve on this idea that we can afford it. And money just magically seems to be there whenever it comes to bailing out major corporations or going to war. I would like to think that we could just as easily do the same if we needed to pay for healthcare, and we certainly do.
It's funny because people say that, like, but people will say, how are you going to pay for it? I'm like, I'm going to get the money from the same place the war people get their money. I'm going to go to the money store where they go, and I'm going to get the money there. Like, why would anybody ever ask about that?
So let me share with you just a couple of numbers, one from the Trump White House and one from a recent study that my colleagues and I have been doing here in Appalachia, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And it has to do with the opioid crisis. And this is relevant because states are settling now with the pharmaceutical companies who have caused so much damage across the country, in this part of the country. The first study, the White House produced a study in 2017, the Trump White House, that is, the Council of Economic Advisors, that estimated the cost of the opioid crisis in the 4 years preceding the study to $2.5 trillion. That's the cost of inaction, just putting Band-Aids on the crisis. So that's how much damage those companies caused nationwide. A study that we're finishing right now in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, looking at the cost of the opioid crisis, the mortality and non-mortality costs in 2019 alone, we're looking at $87 billion. Now, how much did they say the pharmaceutical companies are going to give the states to walk away essentially with the slap on the wrist? $25 billion. And walk away forever. I'm talking $87 billion in the 3 states of Appalachia here for 2019 alone. Now that is, I'm not a lawyer, but that's criminal. And I don't blame the criminals alone. I blame the federal government. I blame the state attorney generals for letting them walk away with nothing but a slap on the wrist. Now, this is the cost of inaction. And guess what? They're going to continue doing the same thing. And this is just opioids. We're not talking about the health insurance companies. We're not talking about the incarceration system. We're not talking about all of the other abusive and extractive, monopolistic oligarchs that are sucking resources. And we're paying for it, as I said, with money, blood, and tears. And that's got to stop, because that's not what democracy was supposed to be.
Wendell, there has to be some type of correlative relationship between private insurance and big pharma. I think a lot of people really, who may have been not fully aware of just how deep this runs on Capitol Hill, but certainly Senator Manchin's relationship with his daughter, Heather Bresch, who runs EpiPen, and the type of price gouging that goes on. Obviously, with a universal healthcare system through Medicare for all, we obviously would be in a situation where price gouging would go away. Is there like I said, is there like a correlative relationship between the two industries? They basically like watch each other's back, so to speak.
Oh, they absolutely do. They have symbiotic relationships, and they pool their money, as I said earlier, to try to kill legislation that either or both of them does not like, and that might cost them a little bit of money. As an example, when the Affordable Care Act was being debated, it wasn't the insurance industry that spent the most. It was actually the pharmaceutical industry that spent the most during that debate. But they worked very, very much in a coordinated way. The pharmacy benefit for the Medicare program, which was created during the Bush years, 2003, was enacted. The insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry made out like gangbusters. They both have fared very, very well, and they influenced how that legislation was written. So they'll point the finger of blame at each other. They do that publicly, but behind the scenes, they work very, very closely together.
Yeah.
And I think, and this is a very good question that Michael Merenstein actually brought up, which is something that, Wendell, you and I have discussed, which is why don't business owners, and I think this is more specifically to small business owners, wildly support Medicare for all, for all the costs they must pay for their employees. I still think there's a lot of people in this country that are just not really aware of how this
I don't know
works.
that that's necessarily true. And I've said this before. My husband's a physician, and he would love to not have to be giving health insurance to his employees. So, I mean, I don't think that's even true. I think a lot of people would like to not have that.
They do. In fact, one of the organizations that I lead, a nonprofit called Business Leaders for Healthcare Transformation. We've got business owners from across the country in every state that support, they came together. We supported Medicare for All, and they do as well too. There are a lot. In fact, most small business owners can't afford to offer coverage to their workers anymore. They've thrown in the towel. And that affects not only their workers, but the business owners themselves that are having trouble finding affordable health insurance. So there is, and even the larger employers, I think it may be a while before we see some of the CEOs of the big companies embrace Medicare for All. But the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Purchaser Business Group on Health did a survey of CEOs of big companies last month, or at least they released the results last month, I think it was. And 87% of the CEOs of America's biggest companies said that the current system is not sustainable for them during the next 5 to 10 years. So they get it, and they're trying other things. Some of them are trying to do direct contracting with big hospital systems and disintermediate the middleman, but that's not really a viable option for most businesses.
Georgia,
Hi, Georgia.
Georgia Davenport, who leads Whole Washington, or one of the leaders of Whole Washington, which is a statewide initiative to put forward a universal healthcare system in the state of Washington. I'd say this question is for both of you guys. What advice do you have for groups like Whole Washington who want to expose the connection between campaign donations and the lack of support for universal healthcare by politicians?
Well, maybe I'll start there. And it is such a strong connection. Whenever I get a chance to talk to healthcare reform advocates, Medicare for All advocates, I say, please try to devote some time and attention and resources to cleaning up our political system. My last book is called Nation on the Take: How Big Money Corrupts Our Democracy and What We Can Do About It. And going back to what we were saying at the top of the interview, it is that influence that keeps us from moving forward. It is not because the people are opposed to it. It's because they are able to spend this amount of money to protect those profits.
Yeah, absolutely. Call them out, name and shame, vote them out. Yeah. That's it. It's that simple. That's how democracy works.
We're working on it.
Yeah, we're definitely working on it.
We're working on it.
And I do think that we need to, I think just and again, a lot of people want to call it the progressive movement. I call it the non-corporate, non-partisan movement, because that's really what it is. We're trying to get away from this idea that we have to be divided along these lines. It's like, Fadhel, you see it all the time. There's like this war between, the UBIers and the MMTers. As far as I'm concerned, you got to find common ground wherever you can, because universally speaking, when it comes to an issue like healthcare, virtually everybody who understands it, who understands the basic parameters of it, and especially, removing the for-profit middlemen in between us and our doctors, people universally agree. And I do think that this really is a unifying issue that more and more people just need to become more aware of, particularly when it comes to the financial aspect of it. Because, again, they spend, as you say, it's a great investment for the pharmaceutical industry and the private insurance industry to invest hundreds of millions of dollars a year in propaganda smearing, in basically saying, no, you don't really want this. It may not be great.
You don't want to lose your insurance. You're going to lose your insurance.
Yeah, you're going to lose your insurance. But then you ask yourself, well, what is the point of insurance? And I guess outside of, obviously big pharma and private insurance, this is a little bit of a sensitive issue, but I think we should talk about it. And that is, there seems to be somewhat of a roadblock with certain unions. It seems that there is a union blockade. Now, I don't believe that this is a problem necessarily with rank and file, but I definitely think it's a problem with union delegates and union bosses. And if you guys can elaborate on that as much as you know, that'd be great.
Yeah, we saw that actually in Nevada when the culinary union was very much opposed to Bernie Sanders' campaign, but the rank and file voted for him. So there is that disconnect
by a landslide.
Yeah, exactly. Part of it is the executives of the unions want to keep the gig going. But negotiating for benefits is such a big part of what they do. They don't want to lose that, and so in my view, it's self-serving rather than really looking after the best interest of the rank and file.
And if I may touch on something related to this, but also related to the question earlier about businesses not supporting Medicare for all and things like that, especially for small businesses and for workers in general, because the dominant narrative tells them that this very expensive government program is going to cost money, and money means that the federal government needs to either tax somebody or borrow from somebody to pay for it, which means your employer might be taxed more, which means your job is on the line. You might be taxed more, your livelihood is on the line. And that's how we corner people into accepting the status quo. They're saying, well, this can't be afforded. This is going to be your community, your job's on the line. What MMT does is actually, tackles that myth directly head on and says, what we do at the federal level is that we decouple the spending from taxation. We spend on national priorities. Health, education, infrastructure, whatever we as a democratic society prioritize. And that's how we do it, by the way, when we're going to war. That's how we do it when we decide we're going to send a man to the moon. That's how we do it when we set the priorities straight and we dedicate the resources, financial, logistical, brain power, and make it happen. But then what MMT does says, we're not saying don't tax anybody. We're not saying don't tax the rich, don't tax the oligarchs. As a matter of fact, tax the hell out of them. Tax them out of existence, but not because we need their money or their permission at the federal level to have Medicare for all. Tax the oligarchs to protect democracy, to reduce their power and influence in politics. Tax pollution because we want to breathe fresh air and drink clean water and save the planet. Tax Wall Street to reduce speculation and financial instability. Those are very important reasons to tax, but not because we need their money and their permission, which means going back to workers, going back to small businesses, this generous healthcare system, infrastructure system, educational system will not be directly linked to taxing your employer or your community or your real estate in order to pay for it. We pay for it with as national priorities, and then we tax for other reasons. And the federal government, by definition, doesn't need to balance its budget, doesn't need to worry in the same way that states and municipalities have to worry about their taxation and spending and balanced budgets. And once you liberate us from linking these two things, then we get the priorities straight, and then we know who we're taxing and for what reason. It's for democratizing the economy, reducing their power and influence. It's not because we need their permission. But if we don't do that, and this is really a problem in the progressive movement, if we directly link Medicare for all to taxing Bezos or otherwise, then by definition, if we want the most generous Green New Deal or healthcare program or education program, by definition, we need the oligarchs to be wealthier, to generate even more income, so we can tax a little bit of their wealth to have our generous Medicare program. And what we're saying, no, we don't need you to be more powerful, more influential, and wealthier. We're going to tax you out of existence.
That's a whole
and we can still afford Medicare and Green New Deal and so on.
Yeah, I think, and this is something that always frustrates me, is how everybody looks at things like it's a pie. So if somebody else gets a big slice, then your slice is smaller. And this is how people look at our budget. And you hear people saying words like debt and deficit and all these things, which to me, when I hear that, I think that they're watching talking points from someone who just doesn't want to pay for things that people want. That's like, to me, those are code words for, yeah, we just don't want to pay for that, because we can have multiple things at the same time. That's what it's not like we are taught that in order to have one thing, we have to forego another. And that's just not true. And I think that when it comes to things like healthcare and education specifically, that they're not costs as much as they're investments, and they shouldn't be viewed in the same way. But yeah, this is what you're saying essentially, is that it's not a pie.
Absolutely. When it comes to what the federal government can do, Congress has the power of the purse. It's not like you and I. It has the spending capacity to address all of these issues at once. And I say it jokingly sometimes, maybe I said it on this show, and I never repeat, it's a joke, I don't really mean it, but just to illustrate, if we wanted to have Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, and all of these things, and we decided at the same time we want to invade Canada, we can probably afford it. It doesn't mean we should. It doesn't mean we should. So if you want to argue for reducing the budget for the military and all that, I'm with you. But not because we need to eliminate the military so we can have healthcare. We can have both.
I don't know if we pull our troops out of the Middle East and you see all the tar sands that they got up there in Canada, we may find a reason to say, "Hey, these Canadians make." You know, remember the movie Canadian Bacon? So,
yeah, no, I don't. You and I do not share the same sense of humor.
So, well, that's all right. So I like toilet.
You have stupid boy humor.
I have stupid boy humor. I've never grown up in that. But one of the things that was interesting in the deficit myth that Stephanie talked about was, when didn't name who the congressperson was, but had a meeting, explained what MMT was, and the congressperson just sat back and said, "I can't say this, even though I know it's correct, but I can't say this." And I'm guessing that there's probably a reason why even the non-corporate representatives that we have now successfully elected to Congress, they are not talking about MMT. And I'm sure that there's a reason for that. And if either one of you or both of you, quite frankly, can address that, because it isn't a national discussion, but we got to figure out a way to make it one on Capitol Hill.
Well, that discussion that Stephanie Kelton is talking about, that's more than 20 years ago. Things have changed in our favor in recent years. So the follow-up to that conversation is why can't you say this publicly? And that particular congressman and others have said, well, get me a critical mass of constituents who understand this. Get me a critical mass of media people who can back me up. Get me a critical mass of this, that, and the other. And my response to those, if I have that critical mass, I'll vote you out of office or get somebody who can do this. But now, 25 years later, I don't know if you've seen the interview on C-SPAN a few weeks ago with Congressman John Yarmouth, who literally explained everything I just explained here in terms of how we pay for things at the federal level and why it's not going to cause inflation and what are the things that we need to worry about. And he answered all the questions about the deficit and the debt and China and inflation and all of this. And he did it beautifully. How did he do that? Well, he spent a little bit of time with Stephanie Kelton and he learned how the federal government actually spends. And he actually read the deficit myth and engaged with ideas that actually give us the tools to have the most prosperous and equitable economy we can afford. And he's totally comfortable explaining it now, because we do also have a critical mass of people in the mainstream media and in the progressive media and organizations and podcasts and newspapers who are actually engaging with this. And because 20 years after doing this, the mainstream of the economics profession has no arguments other than saying, we don't like this big spending, but we can't tell you why, because we thought big spending causes inflation. But wait a minute, Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world for the last 3 decades, and they have no inflation. They actually have deflation. They have negative interest rates, not high interest rates, and their government is not bankrupt. We just don't understand why that is the case. We don't understand why we don't have hyperinflation in the US after 10 years of massive deficit spendings. But for some reason, they say, we know for sure if we have Medicare for all, if we have a Green New Deal, that will cause hyperinflation. And the public is saying, well, BS, we don't believe you because you're not making any sense. And now we're going to listen to an alternative perspective. That's the MMT perspective. We may not completely understand it, but it's making sense. The more we listen, the more we understand, the more it's common sense. And then the pandemic hits a year and a half ago. And what did Congress do? We had a national emergency. We needed to spend $2.2 trillion of COVID relief funding. And the entire 535 people we have in Washington, D.C., with the exception of 3 or 4 who couldn't vote because they were quarantined, they voted in favor of it. And they did not say who they're taxing, who they're borrowing from. They used the power of the purse, which they have, and said, this is a national priority, we're going to do it. And they do it all the time for war spending, for military spending, for tax cuts. It's just when it comes to the things that really matter for the working class and the middle class to say, well, wait a minute, we're out of money. We don't know where to find money. I guess we're going to have to tax the rich or tax the middle class or cut spending on this other thing so we can afford a little bit of healthcare. But other than that, we're sorry, we don't have resources. And we've discovered this with the pandemic, that of course they have the resources, they have the power of the purse. And guess what? It didn't cause inflation. The nonsense you hear in the media today about the inflation pressure that we're seeing right now is directly related to COVID relief, and nonsense. We know the sources of inflation are directly related to supply chain disruptions related to the automobile industry and other sectors, and those will be sorted out within the next few months. And none of that nonsense that links government spending on COVID relief to inflation is absolute nonsense. So we're winning this battle one day at a time, and the public is increasingly on our side. And some common sense politicians who are not PhD economists are increasingly on board with this idea.
One of the things, just to piggyback on that, John Yarmuth is just not he's not just your regular member of Congress. He chairs the House Budget Committee. It's from Louisville, Kentucky, and I used to live there when I worked for Humana. That's significant, and I think you'll see somewhat of a generational change in Congress.
Nice plug there, Wendell.
We'll be clipping that.
Yeah, we sure will.
It's important. Go, Jen. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, when AOC said decouple spending from taxation 2 years ago, people's heads exploded in DC, and they thought that the universe is falling apart. But now you have Cori Bush, you have Jamal Bowman, you have John Yarmuth, of all people, right? Saying this makes perfect sense. We don't need to worry about the deficit the same way you worry about it at the state level. And we're talking about literally dozens of progressive candidates who are running in this campaign, in this election cycle. Not all of them will win, but they're all knocking on doors. They're all campaigning with the right narrative, and they're changing the narrative. They're changing the landscape, and they're not taking campaign contributions from super PACs, which means this is the big push that we need to restore the democratic process, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not by the super PACs and for the super PACs.
And you know what? Even some of the representatives of yesteryear, they may have been corporate captured, but some of them have evolved. I think Ed Markey's probably the best example of that. He used to govern in a completely different way than he did, once the Bernie movement really took off, and the Sunrise Movement got him over the finish line. There's no two ways about it. And everything, we happen to be very close with one of the lead organizers of the Sunrise Movement, and he has more than, kept his word for the environmental movement, just as an example. So I think that there's going to be just sort of this. I mean, listen, there are, as we like to say, appendages within politics that are simply not going to change, and
they're too far gone.
Yeah, they're too far gone. And you're not going to, like our Congresswoman down here in South
too far
Florida,
gone.
She's just too far gone. But for a lot of other representatives, I think some of them are just simply going to evolve because they're going to have no choice. You either do evolve, or you're going to get primaried. You're going to get primaried, and you're going to lose. And so I think that there's a number of places, that we can hit this with, Wendell. And I do think that I think people are starting to recognize that big pharma and private insurance are losing their hold on things. And forgive me for not remembering the exact details, but I remember a few months ago, there was something that President Biden did that was actually not good for, I think, the private insurance industry. And they saw a massive drop in their stock because of something. If you could elaborate on that, forgive me for not remembering the fine details, but it was like everyone could see, they could put 2 and 2 together. It was 2 + 2, 1 + 1 = 2. Like, it was that clear that what he had done was advantageous to working people and disadvantageous to private insurance and even big pharma. And it was a reflection in the stock market. And to me, it all comes down to Wall Street. If it's good for Wall Street, it's bad for us. If it's good for us, it's bad for Wall Street. It really seems to be that simple.
It is, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because you do see a reflection of that in the stock prices of these big companies. I used to handled financial communications for Cigna for 10 years, and I monitored fluctuations in the stock all the time. And I can remember one time in particular when insurance companies were threatened to be sued by class action lawyers. This was back in 2000. And there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about that. Every big company, including ours, took a huge hit in their stock price. They lost an enormous amount of market capitalization in that one day. So that just goes to show you, if you can, through legislation and litigation and education, you can make a difference. We do have, mentioning Wall Street, we have a Wall Street-driven healthcare system. When you look at the earnings from these big companies, the big insurance companies are just making immoral amounts of money. United announced its earnings a few days ago. Anthem did this week, and the profits they're making now is just unbelievable. So but they do this to enhance shareholder value. Their most important shareholder, their stakeholder, is Wall Street financial analysts and their shareholders.
I don't normally put too much stock into the senator from Vermont talking about how good of a friend Joe Biden is to him, but I will say
he's
this.
not your friend.
But I will say this. If Bernie is successfully able to get dental, vision, and hearing into this next reconciliation bill, I mean, for everyone over the age of 65, that is a tremendous victory. I mean, maybe, without being hyperbolic, it might be the biggest victory since Medicare in 1965. I'm curious to what you guys think about that.
It's fine.
What I'm going to say is really nothing earth-shattering. But I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of soccer. And one time I heard about very famous soccer players buying special insurance on their legs. I was like, what? Body parts? And then I grew up and I moved to the US. And I discovered that body parts have separate insurance for eyes and teeth and mental health and all of these things. And common sense. We want to provide health care for a whole human being. You can't exclude vision. You can't exclude hearing. You can't exclude anything. It needs to be included once and for all. And I think the opportunity that Bernie and the Democrats have right now is to just push it through the system. If you don't do it now, when? What are we waiting for?
Yeah, in fact, I think you may have heard me talk about, you might have talked about it when I was on the show the last time. When I've gone to these remote area medical events, these free clinics around the country, the people who are there come primarily for dental care. And this includes a lot of seniors, as well as vision care. And they've got the ability to make eyeglasses right on site for just a tiny fraction of what you'd pay if you went to an optometrist to get glasses. But folks can't afford it, and the Medicare program absolutely must have these benefits added: vision, hearing, and dental. Otherwise, the private insurance industry is really going to take over our Medicare program sooner rather than later. They already control about 40% of Medicare beneficiaries through their Medicare Advantage plans, and the trend is continuing to the point that if we don't do something, if Congress doesn't act soon to add those benefits and make the traditional program more affordable for people so that they have these benefits, we're going to be in big trouble, folks.
That is for sure. And it's a conversation that needs to continue. In the meantime, what are you two gentlemen working on right now that everyone can check out your work?
Don't all come in at once.
Wendell, go ahead.
All right. One of the other organizations I lead is called the Center for Health and Democracy. And we'll be working to support what you were just talking about, to advocate for improving the Medicare program and also to put a cap on out-of-pocket spending for the Medicare program. Out-of-pockets in general is going to be a big focus of my work because insurance companies have moved. One of the reasons I left Cigna was because of the industry strategy to move every last one of us into a high deductible plan. And I'm helping to form a coalition of organizations, a broad broad-based coalition of organizations to raise awareness of the problem that's caused. People with insurance are going to these free clinics. They're going bankrupt. They're turning to GoFundMe because they can't afford the out-of-pocket obligations that insurance companies make them pay now. So stay tuned for that coalition.
Wonderful. Well, on my side, I can tell you things happening at the local level, national level, and global level. At the local level, I mentioned earlier, we have a coalition called Reimagine Appalachia, a coalition of more than 100 organizations here, essentially calling for a mini Green New Deal for the region, investing in broadband and green energy and restarting the CCC to restore the green spaces and create jobs and help people transition away from the incarceration system into employment and housing and so on. And the cost of this blueprint that we're calling for the 3 states, for Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, is a silly $23 billion per year for the next 10 years. It's very affordable. And what we did in the study that I mentioned earlier is to estimate, to tally up the cost of doing nothing, right? And this is what I mean, we're paying for it already many times over. And we're still in the middle of this study, but we tallied up the cost of incarceration and the cost of the opioid crisis. And we're still working on the environmental costs related to this. And so far, the total cost that we have for 2019 alone is $133.7 billion. That's the cost of doing nothing. That's the blood, money, and tears that we're paying and not getting the jobs, not getting the clean environment, not getting the infrastructure. So that's the work that we're doing at the local level, calling on the federal government to do the right thing and to prevent all of this. At the national level, as you know, Jen, I've been working with candidates, progressive candidates, brand new Congress and others on, building their platform, answering the question, how do you pay for it, and pushing for a progressive economic policy agenda for those campaigns. And that's the most exciting thing is really working with these candidates and seeing them through the finish line in November, hopefully, because that's how we're going to take back the democratic process. At the global level, I do MMT-related work with countries in the global south, essentially on climate change, because these are the countries on the front lines of climate change. The U.S. is now on the front lines of climate change. If you're looking at the west coast of the United States and the floods that we're facing. Yeah. And here we're talking about, the need for undoing the colonial and neo-colonial structures that still exist to this day. Because the countries that face the most severe consequences of climate change are developing countries who didn't contribute to CO2 emissions, who happen to be former colonies for the most part, and the countries that actually caused the problem, the colonial extraction and the pollution. Other countries of the global north who are saying, well, you guys pay for it and maybe we'll give you a little bit of charity. And charity is not enough, because when you divide the world into rich and poor countries and you net out all the global financial transactions, we're literally sending $2 trillion a year from the poorest countries to the richest countries, including charity and donations and all of that. So money is moving in the wrong direction. We're not going to fix climate change. We're not going to fix anything unless we reverse those flows. So that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, keeps me engaged. Yeah.
That's why they work tooth and nail to stop having any type of change. The slight adjustment in their bottom line is going to cause them a panic. And now it's just a matter of not if we break through, but when we break through. Fadhel, Wendell, thank you, gentlemen, for coming on this evening. Obviously, I hope this is educational for everybody who paid attention. We'll be dropping the video very soon.
Thank you.
And we definitely have you guys back again.
Oh, yeah.
It is always
It's always
a pleasure.
fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
That's my pleasure. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.